In the wet, suffocating darkness of early July 1944, an SS Sturmbannführer named Heinrich von Prittwitz sat inside a leaking concrete bunker near the Merderet River. His hands were shaking, not from the damp French cold, but from pure, unadulterated tactical disorientation. He had spent 3 years commanding armored grenadiers on the Eastern Front. He had watched the Red Army charge into machine gun fire at Kursk. He had seen British soldiers hold their ground with calculated, stubborn discipline near Caen. He believed he understood the absolute limits of human endurance and military doctrine. But as he opened his field journal, he wrote a phrase that would later puzzle the German High Command. "We are no longer fighting soldiers. We are engaged with armed ghosts who fall from the clouds, scatter into the swamps, and hunt us like wolves in the dark. They do not look for a line to hold. They look for our throats." End quote. He was not trying to be poetic. He was trying to explain why his veteran battalion had just been systematically dismantled by a force that, by all rational military logic, should not have existed. He had just encountered the 82nd Airborne Division of the United States Army, the All-Americans. This is not the story of World War II that Hollywood prefers to sell. There are no clean uniforms here, no slow-motion flags, and no swelling orchestral triumphs. This is a quieter, far more disturbing chronicle. It is the raw tactical record of what occurred when the most fanatical ground forces of the Third Reich, the SS, came into sustained, brutal contact with American volunteers who carried no heavy artillery, possessed no armored support, and maintained no operational line of retreat. They had only their rifles, their knives, and a terrifying collective refusal to die. To understand the profound shock that rippled through the German ranks in Normandy, one must understand what the German military expected from the United States Army. By the summer of 1944, the Wehrmacht had been fighting continuously for nearly 5 years. They had conquered Poland in 5 weeks. They had shattered the French army in 6. They viewed the incoming American forces not with hatred, but with a cold, professional condescension. In the official intelligence assessments compiled by Berlin, regular American infantrymen were categorized as well-equipped amateurs. They were seen as pampered boys from rich cities, heavily reliant on massive artillery barrages and massive air superiority. The German doctrine assumed that if you could bypass the American artillery, if you could cut their radio wires, surround them in the dark, and hit them with armor, the American infantryman would follow logical human instinct. He would fall back. He would retreat. But the 82nd Airborne Division had been systematically engineered to destroy that exact assumption. Activated in August of 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, the division took young men from the coal towns of Kentucky, the steel mills of Pennsylvania, and the hardscrabble farms of Iowa. The Army did not merely train them, it subjected them to a brutal, calculated regime of controlled exhaustion. The physical demands were legendary, but the psychological conditioning was far more radical. The father of American airborne doctrine, General William Lee, and the 82nd's fierce commander, General Matthew Ridgway, built the entire division on a single terrifying premise: isolation. Every regular soldier is trained to look behind him for his supply lines, his reinforcements, and his officers. The paratrooper was trained to expect absolutely nothing. Ridgway drilled a harsh philosophy into the mind of every volunteer. When you jump into the night, you are automatically surrounded. Being cut off is not a tactical crisis. It is your normal operational environment. You do not wait for orders. You move forward and you kill whatever is in front of you. End quote. The army had systematically eliminated every man who required a traditional command structure to function. What remained was a collection of self-contained tactical predators. And in the early morning hours of June 6, 1944, they were dropped directly into the backyard of the Third Reich. The drop was an operational disaster. High winds, heavy anti-aircraft fire, and thick cloud cover scattered the 82nd Airborne across miles of the flooded Norman countryside. Hundreds of men drowned in the deliberately flooded marshlands of the Murderette and Douve rivers. Radios were lost in the mud. Heavy weapons bundles were buried in the swamps. Platoons were broken apart, leaving single privates standing alone in pitch-black orchards, miles from their objectives. By every standard textbook in the German military academy, the 82nd was scattered, disorganized, and tactically combat ineffective. But instead of panicking, the scattered All-Americans began to do exactly what they had been conditioned to do. They banded together in small, mixed groups of 3, 5, or 10 men. Privates took command when officers were missing. They did not wait. They moved toward the sound of the nearest gunfire. The true nightmare for the SS began at the Fière causeway. This narrow stone bridge across the flooded Murderette River was one of the most critical strategic bottlenecks in all of Normandy. If the German armor could cross this bridge, they could drive directly into the vulnerable Allied landing beaches and crush the invasion in its infancy. To secure it, the German command deployed elements of the 91st Infantry Division and veteran armored formations, supported by captured French tanks and heavy mortar batteries. Holding the other side were scattered remnants of the 82nd Airborne. They had no tanks. They had no sandbags. They had only entrenching tools, a few bazookas, and their standard M1 Garand rifles. For 3 days, the battle for the causeway descended into an absolute meat grinder. The Germans pulverized the American positions with constant, relentless artillery fire. The mud turned red. The hedgerows burned. Yet every single time the German grenadiers advanced behind their armor, expecting to find nothing but corpses, the Americans crawled out of the smoking craters. An SS Oberscharführer named Karl Fritsch, who survived the second day of assaults, wrote to his family from a field hospital, quote, "We poured thousands of artillery shells into their tree lines. The ground was completely plowed. But when our tanks moved forward, these Americans did not run. They leaped onto the tanks. They fired through the vision slits. They fought from their holes using knives and the butts of their rifles. There is something profoundly wrong with these men. They do not fight for territory. They fight like they have made a pact with death itself." End quote. The German doctrine had calculated the exact amount of firepower required to break a defensive line, but their calculations had failed to account for a variable that simply refused to bend. To comprehend the terrifying nature of this psychological immovability, one must step away from the grand maps of the generals and look into a single muddy ditch along the road to La Fière. It was here, on the morning of June 9, 1944, that Private First Class Charles Delopper, a 19-year-old giant from Grand Island, New York, found himself and his small platoon trapped. They had been detached to secure a position across the river, but a sudden massive German counterattack had pinned them down in an open field. The fire from German machine guns and automatic rifles was total. There was no cover. The platoon commander was dead, and the remaining men were being systematically cut to pieces by an advancing force of German infantry. If they stayed, they would die. If they retreated across the open field, they would be gunned down from behind. It was a moment where conventional military logic dictated surrender or total annihilation. Private Delopper looked at his comrades, then looked at the German machine gun position across the road. Without a word, he made a solitary, deliberate decision. He stood up. Standing over 6 feet 6 inches tall, he was an impossible target to miss. He stepped out of the ditch, fully exposing himself to the torrential enemy fire, and walked directly down the center of the road toward the German lines. He jammed his heavy Browning automatic rifle against his hip and began to spray fire into the enemy positions, shouting at the top of his lungs. The entire German line focused their weapons on him. Bullets tore through his jacket. A round shattered his arm. He stumbled, fell to his knees, but his jaw remained set. With blood pouring onto the French dirt, Delopper dragged himself back to his feet, raised his heavy weapon with his remaining strength, and continued to advance, absorbing dozens of hits while keeping his weapon firing. Because of his colossal diversion, the men of his platoon were able to break contact and withdraw to safety. When reinforcements finally retook the road hours later, they found the German position silenced, surrounded by the brass casings of Delopper's rifle. He was dead, but he had single-handedly broken the momentum of an entire enemy advance. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. But to the German survivors who witnessed his charge, it was not an act of standard military bravery. It was a terrifying demonstration of a soldier who had completely reorganized his priorities so thoroughly that personal survival had ceased to be a factor in his mind. By the time the 82nd Airborne was pulled from the front lines, they had suffered over 5,000 casualties, but captured every single objective. In January of 1945, the United States Army captured a confidential tactical report written by a senior officer of the German 7th Army. The document read, quote, "In our engagements with the American 82nd Airborne Division, we encountered a phenomenon. The individual parachute soldier exhibits what must be described as psychological immovability. Methods of tactical assault fail to produce the expected psychological breakdown. They cannot be routed. They must be destroyed down to the last individual man." End quote. The SS entered Normandy believing they were the supreme military elite. But in the blood-soaked fields of France, they learned that true strength is manufactured in the dark through suffering and a terrifying refusal to give ground. The Germans called it psychological immovability. The history books simply call it the 82nd Airborne.